We often think of lobotomies as this archaic Victorian procedure that's happening in some dingy mental asylum basement with an evil doctor, candle lights flickering, chains on the walls, people screaming. But this is the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. This is like 50 years ago. This procedure is happening across the world. And, modern hospitals, modern doctors, modern newspapers are promoting this as this pioneering procedure that is going to solve all these mental issues. And Walter Jackson Freeman wasn't just a supporter of this, he was a man who helped make it mainstream.
Murder, cults, kidnapping.
Where the trail goes cold, we keep digging.
This is Dead Ends.
When we hear the word lobotomy now, it sounds kind of unreal, like this cruel, brutal procedure that is obviously wrong. And how did we ever support this with medicine? How did this ever happen? A lot of it is down to Walter Freeman. He built his reputation in a period where actually there wasn't many treatments for severe mental illness. And so there's a lot of people coming with these procedures which are said to cure people. And we've got large institutions which were overcrowded, way beyond capacity, often like 10 times the number of patients that they were built for. Families are desperate. Doctors are under so much pressure. And there's this huge appetite within the world for anything that looks like an answer, anything that looks like it can help. And this is the context, this is the time period that Walter Freeman is operating in. This is when he is rising to fame and becoming a really prominent neurologist and a really major advocate for surgical intervention in psychiatric illness. And to be honest, he wasn't just a doctor, he was a salesperson. He was, I think, when you imagine like the mental health doctor of these films, these evil mental asylums, he is that guy, absolutely, but he's also charismatic, confident, he's really dramatic. He knows how to present himself, he knows how to make something radical sound scientific, something that's quite disruptive sound compassionate, something that's crude and cruel sound like this is actually a solution to these people's issues. And, historical reviews describe him as just tirelessly advocating for this lobotomy procedure and really, really instrumental in getting the procedure accepted within the Western world, within the United States. And so technically, though, Walter Freeman didn't invent the idea of the lobotomy. This was a procedure which emerged from Europe. There was a guy called Antonio Moniz who invented it, and they'd seen that similar procedures as they do with the human lobotomy worked on monkeys. So obviously, naturally, this works on monkeys. This must work on humans as well. They saw the monkeys were more docile, easier to control. And so that seemed like a great thing to do on humans. And actually, Moniz won a Nobel Prize in 1949 for pioneering the lobotomy. The basic idea was that if you disrupted or severed certain connections in the frontal lobes of the brain, then that would reduce the severe psychiatric symptoms. And so in practice, that meant actually just physically damaging the brain in the hopes that all the sort of distress, agitation, delusion, difficult behavior would just fade away. And so the early lobotomy sometimes was known as the lobotomy, and it involved drilling into the skull to sever the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain, this bit from that bit, basically. If you've ever seen the series Ratched, then they do perform this procedure in that. Obviously, it's dramatized, but you get the idea from that. You drill in to separate this bit from that bit. And so this is the procedure that Walter Freeman, along with this neurosurgeon James Watts, was introducing to the US. And It's very invasive, obviously. You're getting a hole drilled in your head and separating parts of your brain. This is brain surgery. This first procedure did require a brain surgeon, a proper operating section, environment, a proper operating theatre. It was serious, it was dangerous, it was a permanent procedure. That sounds pretty horrific already, but that wasn't enough for Freeman. He wanted something quicker, something cheaper, something simpler, something that could just be done on a massive scale. And this is where the transorbital lobotomy comes in. This is the lobotomy that we think of when we think of the word lobotomy. The transorbital lobotomy, also called the ice pick lobotomy, is what we're thinking of. And this is the procedure that Walter Freeman pioneered. After taking the original lobotomy procedure, the surgical procedure, he is pioneering his own version. And so instead of drilling into the skull to separate the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain, this bit from that bit, in effect, you use this like slim pointed instrument, the one you're sort of picturing in your mind. It's called an orbitoclast. And this is inserted under the eyelid and driven through the thin bone of the eye socket into the frontal lobe. It would then be moved in a way that would sever that connection. And so obviously it's very fast. It's very cheap. It could be done outside of an operating theatre, so you don't have the same logistical struggles for the institutions who are doing this, but it is so much more cruel. It's so much more crude. Essentially, you just tapping this ice pick in and wiggling it about. And I'm sure he has some more scientific technique for that, but in essence, that's what people are doing. You're putting an ice pick in someone's brain to sever this bit from that bit. And so Freeman wanted this procedure to be something portable, something that could travel, something that could be widely accepted and just done anywhere. And it did. He essentially went on tour with the lobotomy. He, packs his suitcase and he's going around all these different institutions and in effect becoming this missionary for the lobotomy in America, for his new ice pick lobotomy. And, it sounds like this is something from a horror film, but it's real. He's a real man in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s doing these procedures. And for a period, this is seen as an innovation. They describe how he did it. He would use electroshock therapy to replace anesthetics for this procedure. So you don't have to have all this big operating environment. You don't have to have conventional anesthetics. He would use electroshock therapy to render the patient unconscious and then perform this procedure. And a lot of families were seeing this not as cruelty, they were seeing this as hope. A lot of the families who were signing up for their loved ones, for the people they had put into these institutions, were seeing this as hope, as something that actually is going to be beneficial for that person. Hospitals are overcrowded. You've got all these patients living with these really severe conditions with, severe psychosis, depression, agitation, distress, and families, institutions, doctors, they just can't manage. And so along comes Freeman with this easy solution, something modern that actually seems to work. That it seems successful. And I guess we have to view success within the time frame and within their understanding. It was much less an understanding of these conditions. And so they're taking these people who are really distressed, agitated, who could be quite loud, and now they're quieter, more compliant. They're less reactive, and actually that seems like success to these families, to these institutions, because you've got this problem that you just can't deal with, and it's just spreading, and you're overwhelmed. Your institution just has 10 times the amount of people it should. And so along comes this man who can make everyone less reactive, more easy to control. And so, you think, great, this is much easier to manage for us. Let's go. And I think, this is the line, is what do we view as success? Some patients were described as improved, But others most were just left apathetic, just void of emotion. The bit they're severing from the brain, these frontal lobes, are responsible for emotion. And so if you take that away, these people, yes, they're easy to control because you've just wiped them of personality, of emotion, and you've just created essentially just someone you can control who is just going to be passive. And it just, as in viewed today, even then, it's horrific. You're just creating these people who just have no chance. And Freeman actually carried out around 3,500 of these procedures. This was how efficient he was at this. That is a lot of procedures for one man to carry out. And it wasn't only happening to adults, this was happening on children as well. And amazingly, because it was so recent, this is a recent thing, the 40s, 50s, 60s, we actually have survivors of these procedures who have written books, who have interviews with, who are actually speaking with the parents, the people who put them in. And I think there are certain people we can look at in future episodes. There's a guy, Howard Dully, who did write a book about this. And there are interviews with him after this procedure, just of how he recovered and how actually this came to happen, what the impact was. And it's just so interesting, how could these adults be putting their children into this? But again, in the context of that time period, they're taking this person who they love and they just don't know how to help. They don't know what to do. They're putting them through this procedure, which seems to make them more controllable. And so viewed through that lens, maybe they could see it as successful. But obviously it didn't survive. Thankfully, it didn't survive. And criticism starts to build for this procedure, even from James Watts, who was the neurosurgeon who originally worked with Freeman to bring the lobotomy over, because he's a neurosurgeon. He's pioneered the surgical version of this, which is done by a brain surgeon, and Freeman's taken this, essentially bastardized it into this quick, like, office water cooler procedure, bish, bash, bosh, and you're done. And so James Watts and Freeman's relationship just breaks down, and he becomes very, very critical of this, the actual technique, the procedure, and the results. And it just slowly starts to become viewed for what it is, as crude, as dangerous, as just too reckless. And it becomes so much harder to defend because actually the outcomes are really inconsistent. The damage was really obvious. You just see these people drained, emotionally drained, everything gone. And so by the 50s as well, you've got new methods, new medication coming in. And there's this favouring of drug-based solutions rather than surgical solutions. And so slowly, not overnight, very slowly, this starts to become out of the public, I guess, practice, and people start to see it for what it is. The unsettling thing with Walter Freeman, though, is that it wasn't this moral turnaround. It wasn't some seeing this as a bad procedure that made him stop. The only reason he stopped performing them was because in 1967, his very last lobotomy, the patient died from a brain hemorrhage, and he was then banned from performing surgery. So the only reason this man has stopped, Walter Freeman, is because he's been banned. And it is scary to think about, because I think we look at these people like Walter Freeman, even murderers who we look at in other episodes, and you think this is them. This is in the past. You know, these procedures, especially like within mental asylums, these are things of the past. We would never accept things like this today. And obviously, these procedures would not be accepted. But people like Walter Freeman, who claim expertise and who are able to really effectively sell themselves to the public, I think that is a danger in modern procedures as well, especially with mental health. Anyone with a camera and an internet connection can upload their unfiltered thoughts about mental health and convince people that actually they have solutions for mental health struggles based on no actual expertise, just based on their feelings. And it's dangerous. Walter Freeman was a doctor, and even he could get it this wrong. We should learn from this legacy of someone who actually was able to sell a really horrific procedure, not 100 years ago, 200 years ago, just 50 years ago. And so what do you think? How do you think this man actually left his legacy? Do you think that this could happen again? What do you think about Walter Freeman? We'd love to hear your thoughts, and just on how we can sort of safeguard that thing of caring for people, of not letting essentially psychopaths come up with solutions. Let us know your thoughts on this episode in the comments. And if you've got this far, please hit like and subscribe. We'd love that. We post videos like this all the time, sort of crime, murder, kidnapping, cults, all the juicy stuff that we love to learn about. So yeah, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you at the next dead end. Thank you. Goodbye.